on the psyche of motherhood. Oh, you happy free women, children bring their little offerings, and rosy lips for a caress. They are your own, and no hand but that of death can take them from you. But to the slave mother it is common knowledge that slavery is a harmful institution, one that dehumanizes men by making them the property of other men. But what of the woman figures in slavery, the mothers whose children are also the property of others? How does the institution of slavery affect the psyche of motherhood? In analyzing harrowing incidents in the life of a slave girl in Toni Morrison's Beloved, the former an autobiography and the latter a historical novel based on a true story, it is apparent that slavery had many negative consequences on the mentality of slave mothers or even free mothers with slave children. These consequences were due to physical and psychological trauma, sexual abuse, and the destruction of the natural idea that a child should belong to his or her mother. Accepted in nearly every culture around the world is the concept that a child born of a woman belongs to that woman. She is the child mother, at least in the biological sense, and carrying and birthing the child gives her the right to keep it, protect it, and care for it. Slave women in the antebellum United States, however, had no such rights. According to Roberts in Killing the Black Body, black women childbearing in bondage was largely a product of oppression rather than an expression of self-definition and personhood, especially after the United States outlawed the importation of new slaves in 1808. The duty of slave women became not only to work but to bear as many children as they could, to bolster the slave population, which forced slavery victims to perpetuate the very institution that subjugated them. It was a lot that children born to a slave mother were also slaves, whether the father had been a slave, a free black man, or a white man. Linda Brent laments this prospect when she briefly considers marrying her free black lover. In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, admitting that if we had children they must follow the condition of the mother and realizing that by bearing children she would be automatically subjecting them to all the horrors of slavery, such as the auction block on New Year Day, because of her condition, because slave women were considered stock, and their children were likewise stock. Mothers in bondage had no legal right to keep their children. As O'Reilly writes in A Politics of the Heart, slavery ruptured the motherline by separating families through sale and by denying African people their humanity. Indeed, slave auctions often tore families apart, a process which Jacobs provokingly describes. Saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her. But that took all. I met that mother in the street. She wrung her hands in anguish, and exclaimed, "Gone, all gone. Why don't God kill me?" Instances of this kind are of daily, yea, hourly occurrence, because of the constant anxiety produced by never knowing how long a mother might hold on to her children. Heinert asserts in her article in Narrative Conventions and Race in the novels of Toni Morrison that slavery interferes in filial relationships to the extent that even the natural emotion of loving one's children is dangerous. The effects of this dangerous love can be seen in Beloved when Paul D., a fellow slave from the protagonist Seth's past at Sweet Home, calls Seth's affection for her daughter Denver risky. For a usage to Bislov woman to love anything that much was dangerous, especially if it was her children. Although Seth and Denver have escaped to the north, the scars from Paul D. disintegrated Sweet Home a family have run so deep that he still finds himself reluctant to enter a commitment with Seth, or to accept another former slave's commitment, such as Seth's fierce love of Denver. He can see it only as dangerous. Baby Suggs, Seth's mother-in-law, also raises an important point while reminiscing about her firstborn. All I can remember of her is how she loved the burned bottom of bread. Can you beat that? 8 children and that's all I remember, and gives a concrete example of how lack of ownership of one's children can damage a mother. Unable to learn the whereabouts of her offspring, Baby Suggs forgets them in an effort to avoid emotional damage. As Seth points out to her, however, it is not that she can't remember, it is that that's all she'd let herself remember. Legal ownership of a child, however, was not the only ownership problem that slave mothers had to deal with. Slaveholders didn't often sell children arbitrarily because it was in slave owners' economic interest to ensure that black nuclear families could support each other, meaning that slave owners did not have to support them as much. Still, having a child near was not enough to claim ownership of him or her from the very beginning, because of the fieldwork or housework required. Slavery denied mothers the opportunity to properly care for their newborns. Infants were left with slaves too weak, too old, or too young to work, and mothers could take only infrequent breaks to nurse their children. According to Roberts, infant mortality among slaves was twice that of whites, with fewer than 2 out of 3 black children surviving to age 10. This estrangement between mothers and their children even in the same plantations explains how Seth grew up essentially motherless, even though she knew who her mother was. As she tells Beloved, she must have nursed me 2 or 3 weeks, then she went back in rice and I sucked from another woman whose job it was. My mother didn't even sleep in the same cabin most nights I remember. Too far from the lineup, I guess Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brand. In her autobiography also endured many struggles for ownership of her children. Although able to see her children from her hiding place in her grandmother's shed, she was not able to interact with them for the 7 years that she was there, because hiding from Dr. Flint also meant hiding from nearly everyone. She wrote that she was comforted by the sight of them, but she was still under considerable emotional stress because of the fact that she could not be there for them in the moment, such as when her son Benny was bitten by a dog badly enough to need stitches. She attempted to vent the pain of 7 years in a single line, regarding Benny's mishap. Oh, what torture to a mother's heart, to listen to this and be unable to go to him. As Linda was to learn, even free mothers could have extreme difficulty mothering if her children were still slaves. Her children's slavery and her own fugitive slave status seriously limited how much care she could give them or how much time she could spend with them even after she escaped to the northern states. It resembles her early slave experience in that even while miles away from Flint, she still has to hide from him and other slave owners from her area, which impedes her ability to create a home for herself, Benny, and her daughter Ellen. As far as Ellen was concerned, Linda only had visiting rights to see her. Mrs. Hobbs had told, she wrote, that my child belonged to her daughter Mrs. Hobbs even denied requests for the benefit of Ellen's health, such as a trip to New York to care for inflammation of her eyes. It did not occur to Linda that there was anything improper in a mother's making such a request, demonstrating that she asserted a control over Ellen that Linda, even as her mother, could not undermine. Along with struggles for ownership, many slave mothers as women also had to deal with sexual harassment. Linda Brent is the primary example of this, due to her encounters with Dr. Flint. My master met me at every turn, she wrote, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing that he would compel me to submit to him. Dr. Flint pursued Linda with an appalling doggedness. He wrote her letters when he found out that she could read, routinely visited her at her grandmother's home, and even followed her when she went to visit her mother's grave. Dr. Flint was not the only example of such harassment. Either statistics of the slave population in 1860 show that 10% of slaves were mulatto, demonstrating just how often female slaves gave birth to their master's children, which does not include how many were violated but not impregnated. In addition, the rape of a black slave woman was not considered a crime. White slaveholders could do it without fear of the law and, in fact, as Roberts asserts, used rape or the threat of rape as a weapon of terror that reinforced whites' domination over their human property. Sexual abuse then, essentially, was a psychological tool used by slave owners to keep slave women submissive, in addition to a way to keep slave women pregnant and producing more slaves. Although Linda was never raped, the way that she avoided such a fate was simply another form of sexual abuse. Pressured and feeling as if she had no other choice, she used her body without her full assent by becoming pregnant with another white man's child, to escape from her current situation. Despite the fact that she knew what she did, and she did it with deliberate calculation, she should not have had to do it at all. In addition, despite her calculations, Linda's situation as a pregnant slave only added to her emotional and psychological stress. Although no longer sexually harassed, she was instead plagued by guilt, Dr. Flint's theory, and the disappointment of her respected grandmother. The physical and psychological trauma of slavery also had several negative effects on mothers. Physically, although Linda Brent was never whipped, she was slapped and once even pushed down a flight of stairs. The schoolteacher, however, whipped Seth before she ran, leaving multiple scars across her entire back. As Seth tells Paul D., schoolteacher made one student open up my back, and when it closed it made a tree. It grows there still. With Seth's dialogue, Morrison is describing not only the shape of her scars and the extent of the physical harm Seth has endured, but also turning them into a metaphor for the psychological harm that slavery has caused her, which continues to grow as she and Denver dwell in their haunted house. Paul D. reaction to learning of Seth's beating "they beat you and you was pregnant," though incredulous, probably contained no actual surprise. It was not uncommon for pregnant slaves to be whipped, and there was a standard procedure for doing so. The woman was to lie face down in a depression in the ground big enough for her stomach. Roberts calls this procedure the first example of maternal-fetal conflict in American history, for although the fetus was not being directly harmed by the whip, It was still inside of the mother and thus would take on some of the stress that the mother's body was encountering. This gives rise to the possibility that even while still in the womb, a fetus could be hurt by the mother, although the mother was not intentionally causing pain, and thus come to resent her. This concept is embodied by Beloved, who resents Seth. "You are my face. I am you. Why did you leave me? Who am you?" Because while Seth tried to protect Beloved from being taken back into slavery, just as a hole in the ground might protect a fetus from a whipping, the psychological stress that Seth endured was transferred to Beloved, and that Seth felt that she needed to kill her to protect her. Thus, Beloved's life was cut short and she was separated from Seth before she wanted to be, which she felt was a great injustice. Because of slavery, the maternal-fetal conflict was spurned into a mother-child conflict as well. A radical psychological side effect of slavery on the mentality of mothers was the contemplation of infanticide. Jacobs mentions in her autobiography that slave mothers often wish that they and their children might die before the next day dawns, and when she became a mother she began to take on those tendencies as well. When her son became ill as an infant, she prayed instinctively for his recovery before realizing that she might be better off praying for his death. What mockery it is for a slave mother to try to pray back her dying child to life. Death is better than slavery. This supports Lavender's thesis that the constant stress of the slave mother's conflict between wanting her children yet knowing that slavery is not a good environment for them will eventually cause the mother to show her love by desiring her children death. Seth in Beloved is the strongest example of this, as she actually does attempt the murder of her 4 children when her old master comes to the north to find her, successfully killing her third. Almond asserts that, at the basic level, Seth does this due to a state of hysterical depression, perhaps even psychotic disassociation which resulted from her traumatic memories of slavery, in addition to a desire to keep her children out of slavery. Echoing Jacob's opinion that death is better, Seth also subconsciously relates the loss of her own mother, killed for an unknown reason, to the loss of her children, which she will not stand and, psychologically, cannot stand. Her plan is to eventually unite all of them in death, away from slavery, thus fulfilling her role as a mother and protector as she sees it. Another explanation for Seth's actions, which perhaps compounds with Almond's ideas of unification and Sephidian death, brings up the idea of a slave mother's ownership of her child once again. Lavender theorizes that slave mothers sometimes committed infanticide in order to exert maternal control over their children to truly own them. Seth believed that she had the right to kill her children in the face of slavery because if they went back into slavery they would no longer be hers. O'Reilly writes that Morrison's own view on motherhood was that motherhood was a type of liberation and self-realization, especially considering that once Seth was free from slavery she was also free to move through her children as she saw fit. For the slave owners to come back and claim her and her family would be losing 2 freedoms, simultaneously, not just legal freedom, but her freedom and self-identity as a mother. Seth's case, based on the true story of an escaped slave, was not a unique one, either, although it is difficult to tell how many slave children died as a result of abuse the mother endured during pregnancy or poor nutrition. There was an extremely high mortality rate for slave children, and infanticide was not uncommon. It would be ridiculous to argue that slavery was not detrimental to motherhood. Not only the mother's emotional state, but also how she was permitted to care for her children. One only needs to look at the ordeals a slave woman had to go through before she actually gave birth, such as sexual harassment and the possibility of rape, or having to do a slave's arduous work while pregnant, or being whipped while pregnant. All of those things have the potential to cause emotional trauma. And there was also the possibility of harming the fetus in the womb through overexertion or pain. Even without the previous harmful psychological effects of physical or sexual abuse, a slave woman had to endure other trials after she became a mother. The inability to nurse her newborn as often as they had needed it, the law that made children the property of a master and often prevented mothers from protecting them, and the constant threat of a child being sold away. These trials doubtlessly caused unending stress, to the point where some mothers, such as baby Suggs, ended up trying to forget about their own children in an attempt to avoid it. The lack of ownership over one's own child, coupled with the memory of trials endured in our own lives in slavery, could prompt mothers to kill their own children for their children protection, as Seth did. Although Seth and Linda were both portrayed as capable and loving mothers, owning houses and holding jobs to provide for their children, ultimately neither of them had a particularly happy ending with Seth's children. Linda were elsewhere, and she became the custodian of a white child instead, and of Seth's 4 children, only Denver remained. As Jacobs wrote, the slave mother may be an ignorant creature, degraded by the system that has brutalized her from childhood. But she has a mother's instincts, and is capable of feeling a mother's agonies as many slave mothers were capable of mothering, as free mothers, but in the end, the institution of slavery did indeed brutalize them, and ultimately they were hardly allowed to be mothers at all. Works cited Almond, Barbara, The Darkest Side of Motherhood. Child Murder. The Monster Within, The Hidden Side of Motherhood. London. University of California Press, Limited, 2010. Heinert, Jennifer Lee Jordan. Remembering Race, Realism and Truth in Beloved Narrative Conventions and Race in the Novels of Toni Morrison, New York. The Taylor and Frances Group, 2009. Jacobs, Harriet, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Clayton. Prestwick House, 2006. Print Lavender, Caroline. Following the Condition of the Mother, Subversions of Domesticity in Harriet Jacobs. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Southern Mothers, Fact and Fictions in Southern Women's Writing. Nicoyalty Warren and Sally Wolf, eds. Louisiana. Louisiana State University Press, 1999. Print Morrison, Tony. Beloved. New York, Random House, Incorporated, 1987. Print Roberts, Dorothy. Killing the Black Body. New York, Vintage Books, 1997. O'Reilly, Andrea. Toni Morrison and Motherhood, A Politics of the Heart. New York. SUNY Press, 2004.